All right, so this is the one, number 4. This is the one I showed you last time. And during the day, I let it render, and this is how far it got. So it got about 42 frames is how far it got during the day. It ended up taking about 8 minutes a frame. Okay, so when we start adding stuff like motion blur, we start adding some better shaders, better lighting, better everything, our render time is going to go up. And that's just, it is what it is. So if we had 90 frames, which is what I believe I had, times 8 minutes a frame, that's 720 minutes, which is basically 12 hours to render that out, okay? So just keep that in mind. That way, like I said, you can work on one on your station and then render it off on another station. That's totally acceptable to do, okay? A little trick for you, if you're trying to move your files to another station, you don't want to unplug your jump drive, all the computers in this room are networked together, so you can actually access any computer in here from any other computer in here. And the way you do that is you go to the browser area, you type 2 backslashes, and then you put the name of the computer. So all the computers are named the exact same thing with the exception of their number. So this is SR127, South R127, and then the dash, and then S, and then if you look at your monitor, you'll see that each monitor has a S number on it. That's the actual individual number for that. So Morgan, what's your computer number? 99? Okay. Once you've done this a billion times, you know where they are, or you know at least where they are. It'd be SR127-S, whatever that number is, okay? So you put double backslashes SR127-S17099 or whatever number you're looking for. And then the drive that you have on the computer is the P drive. Turn this down a little bit. Then you would put P $sign, okay? So SR127-S17009, 099, backslash P $sign. And what this is going to do is it's going to take me to the P drive of that computer. So now I can copy stuff. Don't ever work off of it, because if that computer gets shut down, it won't work. You can copy stuff pretty directly from one computer to another computer without having to unplug drives and stuff. This is especially helpful if you decide you're working on several different computers, you're rendering on several computers. You can log into each one, grab your files, and put them onto your own computer, okay? Especially if someone is working on your computer and you come into lab and you need to get your files, you don't have to interrupt them. You just boot up the other computer, connect to your computer, and you can grab the files, okay? So that will definitely help you out. So this was the one like I showed that I did last time. Boop. And then, which number is this? That's 4. This is 5. And then this is another one that we're going to do, which is just breaking. And like I said, we can animate it backwards so that it comes together. Now I also did another one just kind of screwing around. That's number 3. So this is a different kind of breaking. This one, the pieces stick together a bit more, and they actually like pop instead of just falling, okay? So again, it's just not, it's basically a matter of building the setup of how the pieces are broken, and then you could actually have things glued together or stick together and then explode and do all this fun stuff.
I hate to be a grammar Nazi, but isn't it supposed to be EA instead of AK?
It is, if you meant to spell it that way. But I want it that way so you would think it was something else, and then you would see that. Okay. So I did it purposefully. But if I did want to change it, and remember, because of how this thing is set up, we can go back to that original one, type in whatever word we want, and the whole thing will happen again, okay? Which again is like super awesome to be able to do. So all 3 of these are done inside of Cinema. It's great because it is this easy workflow of just changing stuff in there. And this is, we type the text, whatever it is. This one was something that I was playing with inside of Maya. Maya is another 3D program. Typically people use it for movies, video games, VR stuff. If you wanted to do motion graphics in it, it has motion graphics stuff. They've added that in there. It works a bit different than Cinema. Cinema stuff is actually a little bit easier to see how things are connected and duplicate stuff. But some of the abilities in Maya are Cinema just doesn't have it. So this was basically, I wanted to take an image and control the scaling of objects using an image. So that's what this does. Okay, so all of this is being scaled out because of an image. So I have basically a black and white image that controls the scale of these items. So these items here are now being scaled to 0 because it's black in that area. These items are staying scaled to, I think it's 10, because there's white in that area, okay? Now something like this, I wouldn't be able to update a piece of text, but I could update the image. So if I change my image, instead of the Macomb logo, I used my own logo, I used whatever, it's simply a matter of dropping that new logo in there, and then boom, this entire animation happens again. Now always think about two different ways that you can kind of show stuff off. So from this view, I actually liked, where is it? Like that frame right there I thought was cool. I like how it's kind of pointillized here. I thought that was like a neat way to show that. And there's also, it's hard to see in this image, but some of these are basically like cubes that are just stretched out, and some of these are like spheres. And depending on the color, it would pick either a sphere or a cube, which is again something that you can do. I also shot this from a different angle. So this one is from more of like, looking at it from the top of it and seeing that thing do that, which again, you really get a lot of cool stuff. When you're in motion graphics, you have to be able to look at this as basically graphics and how do I want to show it off and what do I want to do with it. There's a lot of cool things that you can do with just these little stupid stuff like this. Let me grab this. 20 here, images.
Do we have to do that?
You don't have to do that, no. It's just me showing off what I do. This is a material that I built inside of Maya. And again, this is using some kind of motion graphics, and I could take my entire cube scene that I just built with the MCC logo, and I could have these be the cubes instead of the other ones be the cubes. Now the reason for doing this, one of my other students in another class wants to do, if you've ever seen Hunger Games, the second one where you guys have seen Hunger Games at least, okay? You know who Katniss is, right? There's a scene where she's training and there's these cube hologram people that are like she's fighting the cube hologram people, and the student wants to rebuild that. So this is playing around trying to build a cube hologram person. So this is one iteration of a material that I could use for that, and then this is another iteration of a material I could use for that. And again, they're all using basically the same principles and processes. It's just a matter of how they're animated, what they look like, the same thing, okay? So your stuff that we're doing here is definitely not limited to just logos. That whole process can be applied literally to anything else. Even our environments that we did, we could animate our environment growing just like we're doing with this. You could actually, that could be an animation, is all your buildings kind of like popping up into frame versus just being there, right? So think about different ways you can use that. I don't need to save that, no. Cool, break. All right, so let me open up my other one. So we go back to the original one, logo design. There. All right, so that's where we left off last time. We set up all of our stuff. Yep, so we're only rendering 60 frames. All right, so now for my next one, I don't want to render out all of my stuff on top of the other one. So the first thing I always want to do is just make sure that I rename this. Because when I do iteration 2, when I do my second logo, if I were to hit Shift R, it'll automatically go through and overwrite all of my original frames, okay? So if I've already rendered something out, I don't want to ruin that. So this one is going to be Explosion, okay? So I'll put Sarcona Explosion. I also want to make sure that I'm not rendering all my frames, so I just go back here and say Current Frame. I don't need to put Motion Blur on this because I'm still previewing it. And my anti-aliasing, I can just set this back to cubic for now, okay? Now all those settings I just turned off, when I do my final render, I have to turn them all back on. So I have to remember to do that. All right, so this is where we left off last time, where this happens, okay? And that's rendered out and whatever. So now I want to move on to my next one. So what I need to do is I'm going to hide all of this stuff. So I just go to my layers and I turn that off. I have to make sure I turn off the eyeball here and turn off the rendering. That way when I hit Shift R, it doesn't render the text also on there. Okay, no text. Now I'm going to take this one, which is my original text that I had, and duplicate it. And then I can turn these back on. All right, now the way this one is going to work, let me jump out of my camera for a second. If you're ever concerned about accidentally moving your camera, you can always go to the coordinates for it and just set keyframes. And if you set keyframes for it and then I accidentally move my camera, when I rewind, it'll just jump back to where it was. That way I'm always stuck with that view and I don't accidentally screw it up. Okay. So what I want to do with this is we want to basically explode it. Now there's two different kinds of explosions. The ones that I just showed in the other file were geometry explosions where actually it was like chunks of geometry kind of floating off of it. What I want to do is have it basically imagine each one of these things is hollow. So instead of it being like a solid O, it's actually just like a hollow O, and these faces are basically just going to fly off of there. Okay? So every one of these lines, every one of these faces is a separate piece. So I'm going to grab my text, which is right there, and I'll just rename this explode. Cool. And I'm going to go to my MoGraph, and I'm going to go to my PolyFX. Okay. Now, by default, the PolyFX, by me just clicking on that, doesn't do anything. You'll see that there's no connection here at all under any of my stuff. This has to be connected to it. So I drop this into that. And now it's actually like a separate piece. Okay. Now we can't see that they're separate pieces because they're still in the exact same spot. If I go to the PolyFX and I go to my transform and I move it, oops, maybe not. Maybe I do have to create an effector. Let's go to random. Let me turn off my wires too. There we go. Oops, actually I have it in the back in the wrong order. There we go. So this goes inside here. There we go. So the PolyFX goes under the MoText, and now we have our random on there, which will then explode this into a bunch of tiny little faces. Okay, now this is why originally when we broke up our text that we wanted everything to be pretty square and uniform, because if I go back to my original text and I turn basically all that off, if I just set this back to n-gons, you'll see how we get all of these like weird long pieces and that looks odd. Okay, so that's why originally I wanted this to be pretty uniform so that it's broken apart. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my random and I'm just going to control how random this is. So I'm going to go to my parameters and I'm going to control things like position or scale or rotation. Okay, now the way it works is I just click it on and then I can adjust those settings. If it's not checked, it doesn't get affected. So right now position is the only thing affecting or being randomized. And when I type in 50, it's just randomizing the position in X50, in Y50, and in Z50 centimeters. So if I set this to just so you can see 1 here, 1 there, and 50 there, you can see how it's just randomized in that Z direction. Well, let me zero these out so you can really see it. There we go. Okay. Now you'll see that some are still going up and some are still going left and right. That's because they're all being based on where they were facing. So a face like this being randomized in Z may go up. A face like this being randomized in Z may go that way. So that's why it's kind of going out like this. Okay, and the same thing with the X. You can see how that's going this way, and then the Y would go the other way. Okay, so I'm going to give this a little bit of randomization. So let's just say 5, 5, and 5, maybe a little bit more. And this is going to be different for every scene. If you scaled your text up huge, it'll be like a lot bigger than mine. I also want to randomize a scale sum. And I'll do uniform and absolute. And I'll go -1. There we go. So now you'll see that some of these pieces are super tiny and then some of these are obviously bigger. I'll also randomize the rotation. And I basically can just put in 90 for each one of these, and that's typically good enough. Okay, So now this is pretty random. Now just like the other one where I did the scaling and the rotating, this one has a fall off, and I can use this fall off to control where this randomization happens. That way I can have the text actually like build back into itself. So I'm going to change my shape to, I'm going to change it to linear, but just so you can see what the other ones do, this is what box does. Okay, there's two areas, this inner box and the outer box. The inner box is like 100% of where that effect is going to happen. The outer box, past the outer box is 0%, and then between the outer and the inner is this like gray area where it's like halfway. It's like a transition between the two. So as I drag this down, you can see how the R starts to get affected, and then once it gets in there, it really gets affected. And then once we pass that area, then it's going to start going back together again. Okay? So this is something that you could animate this thing kind of going from one side to the other if you wanted to. You could animate it going from top to bottom. You could even animate this scaling up. Okay? So you probably have seen lots of logos or things like that on TV where the logos kind of like come together all at once. That's exactly how they're doing this, is it's broken apart like this, and then they just come together right at the end. Okay, so I can make that pretty big like that, like that. I could even take this inner area and control where that fall off is. Cool. And there's other shapes in here as well. So box is one, capsule is another. You can play with all of these if you want just to see what they do. There's one called noise, which will give you basically just this noisy pattern throughout. That way you can kind of animate it moving. In all cases, or in some cases, you may not want it to just statically turn on or turn off, but you may want it to kind of fluctuate. So instead of our scaling and rotating, just like boop, it happens, I could have it just like kind of jostle around and move a bit throughout the entire thing. Especially if I had it, let's say, animated to music or something, or I had just, you know, a more wavy kind of logo. There's also a sphere. Sphere works the same way. You know, you have a sphere that moves around. Oops, there it goes. Okay, so I'm going to go back to linear. And the reason that I'm using linear here is that it is, I want it to go off and then come back on. Okay, so I want the effect to be not there and then there. Oops, and I have this backwards. I need to rotate it this way. There we go. Now, in screwing with my other settings, I've messed something up, and so I have to go back to my random, back to my fall off, and change that. Maybe make this bigger. There it goes. Okay, sweet. All right. So now you'll see that these aren't actually disappearing. They're still staying on screen. And what's weird about it is that it hits this point, and then it's still like, it just stops. Like, right, these pieces are all stopped. But then as this moves, these pieces are moving in. So random is good because it gives us random pieces. Everything's not the same size. Okay, so we do get some movement. But I still need something that's going to control their overall, like scaling from nothing to actually something, okay? So I'm going to go back to my poly effects. I'm going to go back to my MoGraph, back to effector, and then this is where I'm going to use plane. And plane was what we used on the last one the entire time to create that whole mess, okay? I'm going to go to the parameters. I'm going to turn off position and just turn on scale for now. Typically, I check both of these boxes, and then for this type of effect, I set that to -1. Okay? Now, just like random was right at the beginning, everything has this effect on it. So everything just disappeared because everything is now scaled down to -1. So I have to go back to fall off, and I have to make another linear for this one. Okay, so each one of these has their own linear just like the other one did. And that's the correct direction there. I want my words to always write on the screen from the left to the right, okay? That's how we read in America, so that's what we want to do, okay? If it goes the other way, then it's confusing because people just can't read what you're writing.
So it has to be the same for like the original and for the new one you created, like.
You mean how it writes on? Yeah. Yep, always have it go from left to right. Because if I did my sarc.o from the other side, then be O points, they get confused, right? So with title, very quick typically. We want it to read as easily as possible for them. So we're going to go that way. Okay. Now just like the other one, I'm going to make sure that there's a little bit of offset between these two. And then I can grab the plane, I can grab the random. I'm going to group them just like I did on the other one. And then now you can see how these are coming in. Now I have to find that sweet spot of where they move together perfectly. Like that looks pretty good there. Okay. Now if I wanted more movement, like I really want these things to look like they're like exploded and coming together, like let's say they're particles floating in the air that are just coming together to form my name, then I want to really emphasize the random or even go back to the plane and start playing with that. You could have effector, you could have like a million effectors like on one thing if you really wanted to. So I'm going to go back to my random and I'm just going to control the X direction, maybe put this to 100. And let's put the Y to 100 also. There we go. I guess we're going to do the Z too. It just looks like it's not very thick. Looks a bit better, okay? I could also go back to the plane and I could have the position of the plane ones being moved up as well. So you see how this one, before it's just like flat, now it's like above kind of forming into these letters because the Y is here. But I could, again, just kind of play with these numbers, maybe make this 20 and 20 and 20. And then just watch it and see what it looks like. Like that looks pretty good. Okay, so I'm satisfied with how that looks. Okay, now that's it. That's all we have to do. The material's already set up for it. The light's already set up. The camera's already set up. It's just a matter of we added this little poly effects here. We added these two effectors, and then we're just going to animate this thing going across. So just like last time, I go until it's gone, right? So I'm going to move this over until all my particles are gone. Right about there. And I'm going to just set a keyframe on the random plane at 0. So I make sure I'm at 0. Set a position keyframe. Now this is just moving in the X direction, so I can just hit X. I'm going to go up to 60. I'm going to scoot this over, and the same thing. I'm going to wait for it to be fully completed, right there, and then I'm going to hit another keyframe. Okay, now if you mess up and you don't get it right in the same spot, just go back to that spot, move it over, set a new keyframe, it'll just overwrite it. Or you can click in the timeline here on the keyframe itself and just hit delete, and it'll delete the keyframe and you can remake the keyframe. So now I can preview it, boom, that looks great. Okay, so there we go. So then I would go and set up my other settings in here so that I'm rendering all my frames, or I'm doing my frame range, which is 0 to 60. Under my anti-aliasing, I'm setting this back to Mitchell. Under my physical, I'm setting this back to motion blur. That's already named, that's named, yep. So everything's good. So now I could actually go through and just hit Shift-R and let it go through the process and probably save first, right? There we go. Now I can hit Shift-R and then render the whole thing out. Now just to be aware too, the placement of which one of these, plane or random, is first will dictate how the animation plays out. So just so you can see it, look how it's broken apart and it comes together nicely like that. Now if I took the plane one and I moved it before the random one, it comes together in a different fashion. Okay, so just be aware that that will play a role too, which one happens actually first. And by first, I just mean there's an offset here between them. So this plane that I have selected, this one is going to start affecting it first, and then random will. And then what that also means is that plane will stop first, and then random will have a little bit of random at the end. Okay, either one's acceptable. Just make sure that it doesn't look stupid of how it's animating. Okay, what I don't want it to do is look like this. And that's why we're using the random, because that kind of looks a bit cheesy. It's just kind of like coming together. Now, some logos may warrant this kind of effect. I don't like the effect personally, okay, for my name.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Would you have to use this only on text, or could you just like
Any object. Yep, you can use it on any object. And then the next one that we're going to do, which is going to be the fracture, that's really where it starts to turn out really awesome, because you can do that kind of stuff to it, where it actually breaks into chunks on any object. And if you've seen any movie nowadays, there's some scene where something breaks apart or shatters or does whatever. Typically, they're using those kinds of fractures here. The great thing about cinema is how quick it is, right? So this kind of effect is like pretty immediate, and especially the fact that I can rewind this and hit play, and it's playing back in pretty realistic speeds is awesome. Now I'll show you Maya so you can see how Maya would change how we interact with this, okay? Maya was built for movies. Cinema came onto the scene years and years and years ago. It was basically trying to compete with Maya at the time. It could do some stuff, but it really wasn't there. It wasn't until cinema started doing a lot of the motion graphic stuff and computers got a lot quicker, they can do this kind of stuff better, that cinema really started taking off, especially because it's linked to After Effects. It's awesome. Maya is now trying to play catch up with its motion graphics just to kind of capture back some of that market. Because at the time, if you wanted to do anything like this, you would jump into Maya or another program. Typically Maya was the one people would use. Let's go to this. Let's go to this. And logo. So you'll see the interface is pretty similar to Cinema's. There's, our work area. This outliner over here is where basically all of our objects would be listed. So instead of the top right where Cinemas are, layers are down here, so they're pretty much in the same spot. All right, so this is reading, it's thinking. There we go. So I rewound this, and now I'm going to hit play. So this is it playing back. As fast as it can play back, this is how fast it's playing. Okay, so this kind of effect in cinema would be done a different way, but it would be a bit quicker as far as how it plays out. Okay, so I'm on frame 15. All right, so not great for this kind of stuff, but it can do it. This effect specifically, because I'm driving it basically with an image, I haven't found in cinema how to do that yet. So I'm still kind of looking between the two. Now where Maya really is good, I don't even know what this is. Let me see what that is. Oh, it's that one. Is like animation, just straight animation stuff. So if I'm modeling something, I'm building actual geometry, Maya is great for that. If I'm doing animation like this, Maya is great for that. If I'm doing something where it's more procedural, which is what all these kind of effects are, Cinema is great for that, okay? So sometimes artists will actually work between multiple softwares in order to get the best result out of each. So let's say something like this. I may want this stick here. I want to animate him in Maya, but then I want to add some kind of effect on top of him. So I could do my animation inside here, export out just the animation and the geometry, bring that into Cinema, do some stuff there, export all that stuff out, bring it back into Maya and do my rendering, or into any other program that I choose. There's like a whole list of 3D softwares out there. So if you really get into 3D, you can really specialize in just one software. There's another one called Houdini, Side FX. And this is another software. So if you've ever seen any fires or explosions or heavy stuff breaking in movies, or you've seen crowds or anything like that, typically Houdini is where they've done it, because Houdini is just fantastic at being able to do that kind of stuff. Like this guy with all the fur or all the leaves and whatever else on him. Well, that's in Unreal. I don't know why they're showing that. that's Maya. Why would they show Maya stuff when I look that up, right? Breaking. All right, I'll just look up applied Houdini because this guy has some awesome stuff. Bless you. Terrain destruction. This one's cool. So this is a digital effect that he's creating inside Houdini. So he has this little laser that hits the ground. When it hits the ground, these other things explode, and then it creates all the dust and debris and particles and whatever else. So that's like super awesome. And then he has this one, which is another one, which is cool. Now Maya can do some stuff like this, but to get to this level of realism would take literally forever inside Maya. There's software, each software basically has their strength. So Cinema 4D's is motion graphics, Houdini's is dynamics, and then Maya's is typically modeling and rendering stuff. Cinema does have some pretty cool stuff for rendering too, because at one point all of the software had their own rendering engine. So when I rendered something in Maya, it had its own materials and shaders and lights and everything else. And then when I go into Cinema, it had its own. And then when I go into Houdini, it had its own. Well, now they have plugins basically that would go across each platform. So the same kind of render I could do inside of Cinema, I can do inside Maya, I can do inside Houdini. So depending on how deep you get into using this stuff, you could really play with some awesome things. Octane Renderer is a really cool, renderer that's out on the scene now, and the biggest thing with it is that it is GPU based, so it's using basically your graphics card, and people are buying. So if you're not familiar with this, inside your computer there is a processor, there's RAM, there's a motherboard, and then there's a video card. Okay. So your video card typically in the past has always been for your gaming and Photoshop and Illustrator and After Effects. Well, people will buy these bays where you can have multiple graphics cards in there, and all the graphics cards are actually basically using all their computer power to render this stuff out. And they're doing it in pretty realistic times or pretty quick times. But like I said, the more you get into it, the more involved it gets. I really hate that Google now has gotten rid of this view image button. It's the way of the world, right? So this kind of stuff is like, that's stuff that you can create. It's like super awesome stuff. Same thing there. So if you get a chance, definitely go online and just look at pictures of 3D renders, because you'll be surprised at what even novice people who are just doing this as a hobby are creating. See, this is the one specifically for Cinema. Depth of field, glares, glints, you can create some really awesome stuff. And the best thing, like the reason I love 3D is because literally it's creating something. If you draw something, it's like a piece of paper that's just a flat drawing. If I build something in 3D, there's so many applications. I could print it, so I can make something that actually like exists in the world. I can animate it. I can make it look 2D. I can make it look 3D. I can make it look realistic. I can make it look, anything. I can break it. That's a 3D version of Walter White. It's insane, right? Cool. All right. It's enough of me talking, right? Questions? Sir?
So what do we need to do for our title images, or our title animations again?
You're doing, so far you have two of them. One of them is going to be the rotating and scaling one
Okay.
that I showed last time.
And then the other is the explosion.
The other is this one, which is just a flat explosion. Monday, I will go over the chunky explosion one, which will be like the breaking apart.
Okay, and that's basically it?
And then those will be the three, yep.
I have a video for this new one, the explosion.
This one?
Yeah.
I'm recording it now.
Okay.
So that'll be up there too.